friends, strangers, fellow lovers of jewelry and history, and welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, your favorite niche history podcast about jewelry. As always, I'm Melise, your resident goldsmith and jewelry-obsessed history nerd. If this is your first time listening, hi! I hope you like it here. If you're wondering how I could manage to take a visual art form like jewelry and condense it into spoken words, fear not. There is an entire video series, also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, which can be found on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. If you've been keeping up with the videos, then you might have seen my announcement that we are doing away with the Deep Dive Wednesdays for the next 2 months and switching over to Morbid Mondays in honor of the spooky season, the 2-month lead up to Halloween where, at least here on the northeastern coast of the United States, things start to get crispy. That means that for September and October, the podcast episodes will be standalone topics, as opposed to 2-part deep dives. Although, this episode's topic is spiritually aligned with last month's deep dive into history's greatest jewelry scandals, involving fraud, large sums of money, and inevitably, drama. What if I told you that multiple museums around the world are knowingly, and in some cases unknowingly, showing the work of a very famous forger? This is a topic that I came across while doing research on one of my favorite types of jewelry, something I've brought up multiple times in videos, and that is Renaissance figural pendants. Not just true Renaissance, but also Victorian era made in a Renaissance revival style. And that's really how we get here, because the lines between the two are very blurred for a few reasons. One is the common practice of repairing and, quote-unquote, updating Renaissance pieces during the 19th century by replacing and adding new colored enamel, adding pearl drops and new gemstones, as well as creating pastiches out of bits and pieces of multiple Renaissance pendants mixed with contemporary findings. Another reason it's hard to tell the difference is because there were very intentional fakes being made to sell to the antiques market, being passed off as true Renaissance jewelry, sometimes even being based on Renaissance sketches from long-gone jewelers or near outright copies of existing pieces. In this shady market of well-made fakes, there was one person who faked it better than anyone else: the German goldsmith and historical forger Reinhold Vasters, a man whose work has probably managed to infiltrate every important collection of Renaissance-era gold and silver objects. Born near Aachen, Germany in 1827, Vasters had a fairly unremarkable upbringing and early life, though his father died when he was young and he was subsequently raised by his uncle. After attending school, he trained to become a goldsmith, furthering his skills in London, Paris, and Vienna. He even exhibited his works at the 1851 Great Exposition in London and, at this point, was skilled enough to win a prize. In 1853, he moved back to Aachen and began working for the Aachen Cathedral, making and repairing sacred metal objects. Through this work, Vasters gained an intimate knowledge of multiple eras of goldsmithing techniques and became known as an expert in antique liturgical gold and silver. He likely had to repair pieces dating as far back as the 6th or 7th century, including the setting of gemstones and application of colored enamels. This first-hand experience with antiques, coupled with his education and experience training as a goldsmith, gave him the perfect foundation for the most important, lucrative, and productive chapter of his life, his clandestine art forger era. I'm not kidding when I say lucrative. The man must have made killer money because there are literally hundreds of his pieces spread around throughout public and private collections, both as known fakes and some still masquerading as Renaissance originals. He seems to have taken to a life of technically complicated art crime after the death of his wife in 1859. It appears that he did do some business turning out legitimate works that were simply inspired by historical pieces, as well as liturgical pieces, working with multiple jewelers. But the real work was more involved than that. Through a partnership with the highly respected Vienna art dealer Friedrich Spitzer, a man who recognized the growing demand for Renaissance-era art and objets, Vasters managed to create and sell a staggering amount of not only jewelry, but everything from gold and silver candlesticks to crystal cups with gold-trimmed lids and items as large as cabinets and dressers, all masquerading as true Renaissance and sometimes medieval objects. Truly, the range of items this man managed to convincingly fake is beyond impressive. Vasters and Spitzer met when Vasters was still working for the Aachen Cathedral. A special anniversary event commemorating the church brought his work to the attention of many art and antiques dealers, including Friedrich Spitzer. After his wife's passing, with young children to care for, a desperate Vasters needed to find a way to make more money, fast. His relationship with Spitzer was the key to the kind of career change he was looking for. With the ability to seamlessly repair gold and silver antiques, as well as a broad technical knowledge of old-world goldsmithing techniques, Vasters had a particular set of skills that would lead him to a life of quiet riches and posthumous renown. As you can imagine, there isn't much information available about the inner workings of this decades-long grift, so we will have to make some educated guesses throughout this story. So far, this seems like a cut-and-dried case of art forgery. Not really anything special. Every few decades, some unimportant little oil painting attributed to a master is discovered to be the work of an especially clever Victorian-era or 20th century forger. Fakes abound in the art world. What makes Reinhold Vasters any different? There are a few reasons that Vasters is a league beyond your average con artist. The first one is the most obvious. The sheer profusion of work that he produced is staggering. It's nearly impossible to estimate just how many pieces the man created during his decades-long stint as clandestine jewelry forger, but there are at least 45 pieces attributed to him in the Metropolitan Museum of Art alone. That's just a single museum collection. Some jewelers are lucky to have 45 examples of their work remaining, period. The abundance of work turned out at a level of quality that allowed the entire world to be duped for nearly a century, leads me to believe that this operation involved more than just Vasters and Spitzer, selling the final product to the bourgeoisie. There had to have been at least one or two small workshops of goldsmiths and jewelers involved, not to mention carpenters and cabinetry workers for the larger items like cabinets and tables. It's unbelievable to me that we can have so little record of what must have been a tidy little cottage industry producing near indistinguishable Renaissance fakes. Put a pin on near indistinguishable, because we will come back to that later. I do like to imagine Vasters doing it all himself, a Victorian-era Renaissance man in all meanings of the phrase. Hunched over a workbench, applying enamel powder to a pearl-encrusted dragon pendant by the light of an alcohol lamp. It's a romantic image that I'm sure is at least partially accurate. He had to have been a sort of perfectionist for this scheme to work out, and I don't doubt that he had complete control over the fabrication of every piece. Just for shits and giggles, I did a quick search through the online collections of some of our most lauded cultural institutions. As I already mentioned, and we'll get back to this, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City discovered 45 pieces that could be attributed to Vasters in their collections, with 41 items showing up when you search their digital collection today. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore has 5 pieces. The Rijksmuseum has 2. The Art Institute of Chicago has a single lovely ship pendant. In London, the British Museum shows 7 pieces in their collection, including a circumcision knife. Like I said, the man had range. The Victoria and Albert Museum pulls up 5 completed works, 4 of which are pieces of jewelry and 1 of which is a dagger, plus a collection of over 1,000 sketches made by Vasters. There are dozens, if not hundreds more pieces, either in the collections of museums with a less robust internet presence, in the collections of museums and undiscovered as fakes, or in private collections around the world. Vasters' work comes up for auction every once in a while and seems to be fairly easy to purchase on the antiques market as long as you have the cash to spend. But what about those drawings? They'd been acquired by an art dealer in 1909, most likely after Vasters' death the same year, then donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1919, where they quietly sat in the collections, gathering dust and garnering no notice. Until the 1970s, when someone finally decided to take a closer look. Yes, that's right. Vasters was not caught during his lifetime. His deception wasn't discovered until 1978, when a young curator named Charles Truman was looking through Vasters' drawings and recognized a couple pieces. Then he recognized a few more. In what must have been a career-defining holy shit moment, he realized that he was looking at sketches and drawings of what were thought to be known Renaissance pieces which had been taken at face value as 15th and 16th century originals, but now seemed to be much later works, all made by Reinhold Vasters. Truman wrote a wonderful article for Connoisseur magazine in 1979 called Reinhold Vasters, The Last of the Goldsmiths, which was the first publication to bring to light the fraud that had been perpetrated. His revelation turned the art world on its head, and by 1984, the New York Times was reporting that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had determined that at least 45 pieces in their collections were Vasters forgeries, including one of the highlights of the Renaissance collection, the stunning, vibrant Rospigliosi cup, long attributed to Renaissance master Benvenuto Cellini. That is how good this man was at faking Renaissance art, at least in terms of technical skill and execution. His works were being mistaken for those of absolute geniuses, men who turned the world upside down with their vision and talent. Unfortunately for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, sketches of an identical cup were found among Vasters' drawings. In order to determine the authenticity of the cup, and cup is an understatement, it's one of those glorious, fantastical vessels typical of Renaissance-era excess and luxury, a shell-shaped receptacle supporting a sphinx with the face of a woman, perched on top of an enamel dragon riding a gilded turtle, just pure nonsense. In order to determine its authenticity, it had to be painstakingly taken apart, to examine every single step of the fabrication process, and establish whether or not the materials and techniques used were correct for the era. Again, I stress the pure technical skill and ability Vasters possessed. It was impossible to pin this incredible object as a fake until it was entirely dismantled, and experts could determine that it was constructed using methods that would not have been available until the 19th century. If you have the time, and aren't doing something that otherwise requires your attention, like driving, I urge you to look this piece up, if you haven't already. Take a good look at it. Soak in the details. In fact, while you're going on a photo hunt, check out a few more pieces made by Vasters. Perhaps his multiple mermaid pendants, or his beautiful cut-rock crystal cups and goblets. You can pause here for a minute and go down a little Reinhold Vasters rabbit hole. I'll be waiting. Did you spend some time soaking in the Vasters masterpieces? Are you, too, impressed by his uncanny ability to capture the je ne sais quoi of Renaissance art and metalwork? Chances are, unless you're an expert in the field with a vast knowledge of these fakes, you wouldn't think twice if someone showed them to you as Renaissance originals. You just accept it at face value and move on, especially if you're just talking about a few pieces peppered in a collection here and there. But a weird thing starts to happen when you take in more and more of his work. They blur together. They don't stick in the memory. They don't leave an impression. Somehow, despite the technical mastery and absolutely undeniable beauty of his work, they're a little bit cold and soulless. They have the air of a luxurious trend, with many pieces looking nearly identical except for a slightly different jewel here or an extra pearl drop there. Almost like you could have them made to your specifications, a mix-and-match historical treasure. After digesting enough of Vasta's work, you're left with the impression of visiting a particularly clever film set. Yes, the distressing and aging is very convincing, but if every piece is distressed and aged in the same way, the eye will start to pick up on the pattern. It seems that Vastas came up with a rather clever way to skirt this issue. He incorporated quite a bit of actual Renaissance art into his own creations, with some of his pieces being more akin to elaborate repairs or collages of older art, if you will. He took dozens of cut rock crystal pitchers, ewers, and cups, fashioning gold fittings for their bases and lids. Eventually, he ran out of originals and had to have new forgeries of the cut rock crystal vessels made, but there's a healthy mix of real and fake. Some of his jewelry incorporated older parts, from enameled figures being reused in new pendants, to gems and their settings being removed from Renaissance jewels to add to new fakes. While he designed hundreds and hundreds of pieces himself, as evidenced by his 1,000+ sketches and drawings, he also created pieces that were near copies of existing works. It's pretty safe to say that if he hadn't caved to his artist's hubris and kept a collection of drawings of his work, the majority of his pieces would still be regarded as the real deal today. It's really interesting to me that he did in fact keep all of these drawings and sketches. Committing to a life of intricate and specialized art fraud, at his level of technical skill, meant that he had to forego the name recognition that other masters of the art world would invariably gain throughout their careers. Very few of his contemporaries knew just how talented he was, with the exception of art dealer Friedrich Spitzer, who seemed to be his main patron as well as his business partner, commissioning and purchasing many dozens of works by Vastas to add to his own rather infamous collection, made up of a mix of real and fake. In fact, before the turn of the 20th century, at least a decade before Vastas' death, there were already whispers of pieces in Spitzer's personal collection, as well as items he sold, being made-to-order fakes. Despite this, no one thought to look twice at the work of Vastas, which leads me to assume that their business partnership had been kept relatively quiet. Spitzer employed a handful of other artisans to produce his fakes, and I think it's safe to assume that some of them were more obvious than the pieces made by Vastas. If Vastas produced hundreds of works, and was only one of many artisans employed by Spitzer to create convincing historical fakes, how could the art market possibly support such a flood of forgeries? After the Napoleonic conquests of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there he is again, sneaky Napoleon. European art collections were fractured and scattered, dislocated and missing. The rise of an upper middle class, coupled with a growing phenomenon of national consciousness in many European countries, led to a fervent desire to relocate these missing works of art, as well as to possess them. The burgeoning middle class created an entirely new customer, someone who may not be able to afford an important oil painting or other renowned work of art, but could definitely spend a decent and consistent amount of money on smaller objects like, say, Renaissance-era pendants, and maybe the odd gold-trimmed snuff box or two. Amusingly, and for related reasons, the Victorian era was also an age of medieval fakes, the breeding ground for the kind of obsession that gives us the popular trope of a large suit of armor propped up in the corner of some great hall. In truth, many of these quote-unquote medieval examples of armor and weaponry were made up out of whole cloth by imaginative artisans and unscrupulous art dealers, just like Vastas and Spitzer, looking to sell to a populace that had a little bit of extra money and a lot of romantic notions about the past. Part of what Vastas and Spitzer did, that is, taking broken pieces and repairing or repurposing them into something new, is a completely legitimate practice that has been a part of the jewelry and art world for millennia. Selling these pieces to eager customers with false, inflated provenance and shifty stories about their histories was the real grift. It seems that Spitzer would take his clients' incredibly specific requests and, somehow, turn up with the exact thing they'd been looking for. His customers, instead of being suspicious, were elated. He gained fame and notoriety for his exceptional taste and uncanny ability to find exactly what you were looking for. When he passed away in 1890, there was a veritable frenzy surrounding the sale of his collection, which, of course, was heavily peppered with fakes, though it was only beginning to arouse suspicions then. The collection sold over a 3-month period in 1893, with over 4,000 pieces being sold altogether. The majority of it ended up being purchased by a collector named George Salting, who later donated the collection to the British Museum, the National Gallery in London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, with some of the works ending up in the very museum where Vasters' drawings and sketches would eventually out the century-long fraud. The fervent desire to reconnect with a fragmented past really took deep roots during the 19th century, eventually being referred to as historicism. If we look at the works of Vasters through this lens, it seems like he was filling a pretty important societal need, the desire to have a concrete connection to a history that seemed both vital and inaccessible. The fact that his fraud wasn't discovered until he had already been long dead does seem to color the art world's reaction to it. Had he been found out during his lifetime, would he, instead, have been lauded as a master and genius of his time? This man, who could turn out a seemingly endless number of incredible pieces, so good that they fooled just about every expert and even had some of his works attributed to Renaissance masters, has been relegated to the seedy back alley of art history. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be there, but it's curious that he is so seldom spoken of in terms of how well he faked the damn things. Some of his Renaissance pendants were found out because he was doing finer, more elaborate work than would have been present on the originals, soldering complicated layers together instead of using rivets, a technique that would have saved him time and trouble, and it turns out was era appropriate. But, as I said before, taken as a whole, Vasters' pieces are missing the very essence of passing time that gives antiques such a unique, soulful quality. Yes, to us they are now antiques, and doubly interesting because of their history, but when compared to true, proven pieces from the 15th and 16th centuries, there's an almost safe quality to the fakes, as if they were being made to appeal to a culture that wanted the past, with all of the rough edges filed off. Some of his pendants look almost mixed and matched, like you could pick attributes out of a list and he would whip up your very own custom Renaissance jewel. This loss of substance and watering down of aesthetics are the inevitable downfall of just about any historical revival movement, reducing past art to a collection of sanitized, recognizable symbols. Ultimately, Reinhold Vasters was a man working within an environment that was flourishing in Victorian-era Europe, who gave up the privilege of name recognition for profitable subterfuge, and he was certainly not the only one. He was an incredibly gifted and driven man, as evidenced by both the quality and quantity of his work, who decided to abuse his abilities for light evil in order to provide a product for a hungry market that was eagerly buying up whatever dodgy article came their way. It's absolutely fair to criticize him for the art forgery thing, and it's pretty unfair that he got away without any repercussions. But I do think he doesn't get quite enough credit for the absurd quality of his craftsmanship and the sheer ingenuity required to craft so many pieces, both small and large. There seem to be many supposed Renaissance pieces left that haven't been discovered as Vasters fakes, and I'm sure some will remain undetected forever. It's almost certain that the majority of his known pieces would have forever been thought of as real Renaissance originals had his sketches not been kept and subsequently examined. If you still haven't done it, I urge you to go look at some of his work. It's an exceptional record of a man with a specialized skill set and knowledge capitalizing on the events of his time. They all have the air of something from a fairy tale, made up but so beautiful. So, we've come to the end of the episode, about a topic that I think is really fascinating and worth further research. Forgeries in the art world are not uncommon and always sensational. It must have caused quite a stir of excitement when the news broke that so many Renaissance treasures were, in fact, very clever Victorian fakes. In a way, quality forgeries are their own art form. You can appreciate them through the prismatic lens of history and an appreciation for beauty, as markers of their time, because they will always reflect what was sought after, and as such, what people were dreaming about. Two sources that I used for this podcast that I really enjoyed are the original article by Charles Truman, Reinhold Vasters, The Last Goldsmith, as well as an article from 1984 by Yvonne Hackenbrock called Reinhold Vasters, Goldsmith. Both of these are available on archive.org. If you like this episode, please leave me a rating and review wherever you're listening. If you're listening on Spotify, you can now comment on episodes, which has been very fun and took me entirely by surprise the first time a comment notification popped up. If you would like to support this fun and strange jewelry history venture on Patreon, you can head over to patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. If you join at the $5 a month tier, you will have access to a monthly bonus video, as well as the ability to vote in polls to decide future podcast and video topics. I'll be putting up a poll next week to determine the next podcast episode. If you'd like to get your hands on some fancy tote bags, you can head over to merch.shopmoonhoney.com. I added a new ancient Greek jewelry print, and I'll be adding a few more prints throughout the week. If you would like to watch my video series, you can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, all under the username moonhoney.jewelry. And if you would like to see my goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, you can head over to shopmoonhoney.com. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.